Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the horizon is endless and the shadows are long. In this land of sun-bleached bone and desperate dreams, a helping hand can be the deadliest weapon of all. Tonight, we ask a question as old as the dust itself. What happens when salvation arrives wearing a devil's smile? So pour yourself a whiskey, draw close to the fire, and listen to the story of Alara, her father, and the stranger who rode out of the sun. A story we call The Last Kindness. The sun was a tyrant. It reigned over the vast, thirsty expanse of the Texas Panhandle with an unopposed and blistering authority. It bleached the color from the sky, beat the life from the sparse vegetation, and baked the very soul of the land into a cracked, ochre-colored canvas of hardship. For Alara Thatcher, it was simply the backdrop of her existence, the constant, oppressive partner in the lonely waltz of her days. She was 19, though the sun and the work had tried to carve more years onto her face. They had failed. Her features held a resilience that matched the stubborn mesquite trees dotting her father's homestead, a fierce, quiet beauty that had been hardened, but not broken, by the unforgiving world she called home. She was riding the southern fence line, a length of barbed wire that represented the entirety of their claim on this piece of earth. Her horse, a dun mare named Dust Devil, picked its way through the scrub with a familiar, plodding gait. The rhythmic creak of saddle leather was the only sound besides the ceaseless, low moan of the wind. Alara's father, Thatcher, was back at the cabin, likely resting his bad leg, a permanent and painful souvenir from a cattle stampede a decade ago. It was that leg that had put more of the ranch's work onto her shoulders, and she had borne the weight without complaint. She was her father's daughter, forged from the same unyielding prairie stock. She dismounted near a sagging fence post, pulling a hammer and a handful of staples from her saddlebag. The work was monotonous, physical, and blessedly simple. It allowed her mind to wander, to drift to the dog-eared books she read by lamplight, tales of faraway cities with green lawns and ladies in fine dresses. She dreamed not of escaping her life, but of sharing it. The loneliness was the one thing the sun could not bake out of her. It was a deep, cool well inside her, and at times, its depths felt bottomless. It was the sudden and natural stillness of her horse that first pricked her senses. Dust Devil's ears swiveled, her head high, her nostrils flaring. Alara froze, her hand hovering over the fence post. She listened, her own senses stretching out into the vast, humming silence. And then she heard it. The distant, rhythmic pounding of hoofbeats. Too many for a lone rider, too fast for a casual journey. A knot of ice formed in her stomach, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. And hurriedly, she dropped the hammer back into the saddlebag and loosened the Schofield revolver in the holster on her hip. A gun her father had insisted she carry since she was old enough to properly hold it. She swung herself back into the saddle, her eyes scanning the shimmering horizon. They appeared as dark, wavering specks at first, resolving themselves with terrifying speed into four riders. They were not cowboys or ranchers. They rode with a reckless, hungry posture, their clothes caked with the filth of the trail, their faces obscured by dust and shadow. They saw her, a lone woman on a dun mare, and their course altered, converging on her like wolves on a stray lamb. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her, but she beat it back. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She spurred Dust Devil, not in a desperate, headlong flight toward the distant cabin, but in a calculated angle, trying to keep them at a distance, to give herself room to maneuver. The chase was on. The pounding of their hooves grew louder, a thunderous heartbeat of impending violence. A wild whoop cut through the air, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet whizzed past her ear, a deadly insect in the afternoon air. They were gaining. Their horses were fresher, spurred on by cruelty and the thrill of the hunt. Dust Devil, loyal and strong, was beginning to labor, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Alara knew she couldn't outrun them. She pulled hard on the reins, skidding the mare to a halt behind a small outcropping of sun-scorched rock. She slid from the saddle, pulling the Winchester from its scabbard, her movements practiced and sure. She rested the long barrel on the rock, drew a bead on the lead rider, and fired. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The shot was a miss, meant to warn, to show them she was not helpless prey. It had the opposite effect. It enraged them. They fanned out, their own rifles now barking in earnest, bullets kicking up puffs of duster on her meager cover. Chips of rock stung her cheek. The outlaws were circling, tightening the noose. "Come on out, little lady," one of them yelled, his voice a gravelly sneer. "We just want to be friendly." Their laughter was a foul sound that the clean desert wind could not carry away. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a good shot, but she was 1 against 4. The arithmetic was as brutal and simple as the landscape around her. She fired again, then again, working the lever action, forcing them to keep their distance, but she knew it was only a matter of time. They would wear her down, wait for her to run out of ammunition, and then she pushed the thought from her mind, focusing only on the next target, the next breath. It was then that a fifth rider appeared. He came from the west, riding directly out of the blinding glare of the afternoon sun, a lone, dark silhouette against a canvas of molten gold. For a moment, Alara thought he was one of them, a straggler come to join the fun. But he rode with a different purpose, the straight and wavering line that was not the circling of a predator, but the direct path of an arrow. The outlaws saw him, too. They reined in their horses, their attention diverted to this new and known variable. The stranger did not slow. He rode on at a steady and hurried canter until he was about 100 yards away. Then he stopped. The silence that fell was heavy with anticipation. "This ain't your business, friend," the lead outlaw shouted, leveling his rifle at the newcomer. "Ride on, and you might just live to see supper." The stranger did not reply. He simply sat his horse, a tall, lean figure in a dusty black duster. Then, with a movement that was too fast to properly follow, his right hand blurred toward his hip. The sound of his gunshot was not the loud crack of a rifle, but the sharp, distinctive bark of a cold peacemaker. It was a sound that spoke of authority and finality. The lead outlaw grunted, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky as he clutched his shoulder and toppled from his saddle. The world exploded into a maelstrom of violence. Before the other three could react, the stranger's gun barked again. Another outlaw cried out, his horse rearing as he dropped his weapon. The stranger spurred his horse forward, charging into their midst, his colt bucking and roaring. He was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. He fired not with the wild panic of a man in a desperate fight, but with the cold, efficient precision of a master craftsman at his work. Alara could only watch stunned, from behind her rock. The man was not just a gunfighter, he was a force of nature. He moved with his horse as if they were one being, weaving through the panicked outlaws, his shots always finding their mark. He didn't kill them, she realized. He was disabling them. A man shot in the arm, another in the leg. It was a brutal, calculated display of dominance. Within 30 seconds, it was over. One outlaw lay on the ground, wounded. 2 others were desperately trying to control their panicked horses, their will to fight completely shattered. The fourth, the first one shot, was already trying to crawl away. The stranger sat his horse in the center of the tableau, the barrel of his Colt still smoking, his gaze sweeping over the defeated men. "Get," he said. The word was not loud, but it carried an undeniable weight. "And if I ever see your faces in this territory again, I will plant you where you stand." Scrambling, cursing, and bleeding, the outlaws gathered their wounded and fled, disappearing back over the horizon as quickly as they had come. They left behind only a cloud of dust and the lingering, acrid smell of gunpowder. Silence descended once more, deeper and more profound than before. Alara slowly stood up, her Winchester held loosely in her hands. The stranger turned his horse and walked it slowly towards her. As he drew closer, out of the sun's blinding glare, she could finally see him. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his late 20s. His face was lean and angular, shadowed by the brim of a dark, sweat-stained hat. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they held a weariness that seemed at odds with the deadly speed she had just witnessed. A dark stubble covered a firm jaw, and his lips were set in a neutral line. He was handsome, but it was a hard, chiseled beauty, like a rock that had been shaped by a harsh wind. He stopped his horse a few feet from her. His gaze took in her flushed cheeks, the defiant set of her shoulders, and the rifle in her hands. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice a low baritone, smoother than she had anticipated. Alara nodded, finding her own voice difficult to retrieve. "I am, thanks to you." She looked at his arm and saw the dark stain spreading through the sleeve of his duster. "You're hit." He glanced down at his left arm as if noticing it for the first time. It's just a scratch. One of them got lucky. He swayed slightly in the saddle, and the mask of calm control faltered for a second. The fight had cost him more than he let on. That's more than a scratch, she said, her natural instinct to nurture overwhelming the shock of the past few minutes. My father's ranch is just over that ridge. It's not far. You need to let me look at that. He hesitated, his stormy eyes studying her face. In that moment, Alara saw not a killer, but a man in pain, a man who was, for all his deadly skill, utterly alone. The same deep well of loneliness she felt in herself seemed to echo in his gaze. I wouldn't want to be a bother, he said. You just saved my life, she replied, her voice firm. It would be a bigger bother to me if you rode off and bled to death in the desert. Please, let me help you. It's the least I can do. A long moment passed. The wind whispered through the scrub, and the sun beat down on them. Finally, he gave a slow nod. All right, miss. I'd be grateful. As they rode together towards the homestead, Alara couldn't help but steal glances at the silent man beside her. He had appeared out of nowhere, a guardian angel armed with a Colt, a figure of righteous violence who had delivered her from a nightmare. She didn't know his name, where he came from, or where he was going. She only knew that in the space of 5 violent minutes, he had become her savior. In the fertile soil of her lonely heart, a seed of profound and dangerous trust had been planted. She was leading him home, to the only sanctuary she had ever known, unaware that the serpent had already been invited into the garden. The Thatcher homestead was a testament to stubborn persistence. It wasn't grand or prosperous, but it was solid, built with hands that understood the unforgiving nature of the land. The cabin was made of thick, hand-hewn cottonwood logs, chinked with a mixture of mud and grass that had been baked hard by years of relentless sun. A covered porch ran the length of the front, its support posts silvered and weathered like old bones. A small but well-tended vegetable garden, Alara's pride, was protected from rabbits and deer by a crude picket fence. Beyond the cabin stood a sturdy barn, a corral, and a windmill that turned with a slow, rhythmic groan, its blades a lonely sentinel against the vast, empty sky. This small patch of order, carved out of the sprawling chaos of the plains, was Alara's entire world. Thatcher was on the porch when they rode in, a rifle resting across his lap. He was a man whittled down by time and hardship, his face a roadmap of deep-set lines, his hair and beard the color of sun-bleached driftwood. But his eyes, set deep beneath a craggy brow, were sharp and missed nothing. They were Alara's eyes, full of fierce intelligence and an unyielding will. He had seen the dust from the chase and heard the distant gunshots, and he had been sitting on the porch ever since, a storm of helpless anxiety raging behind his calm, weathered facade. His gaze swept over Alara first, a quick, desperate search for any sign of harm. Seeing her unharmed, his eyes then shifted to the stranger, and the worry in them was instantly replaced by a deep, ingrained suspicion. He saw a man armed with a Colt, wearing the trail-worn clothes of a drifter, a man who belonged to the violent, transient world that Thatcher had spent his life trying to keep at bay. "Alara, you all right?" he called out, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I'm fine, Pa," she answered, swinging down from Dust Devil. "This man he helped me. There were 4 of them. Bandits. They were chasing me." The stranger dismounted slowly, his movements stiff. He stood before the old man, his duster hanging open to reveal the well-worn gun belt, the smooth wooden handle of the Colt a dark, menacing presence. He met Thatcher's wary gaze and gave a slight, respectful nod. "Sir." Thatcher's eyes flickered to the dark, spreading stain on the stranger's arm, then back to his face. He didn't offer thanks. He offered a challenge. "What's your name, mister?" "They call me Kane," the stranger said, his voice even. The name hung in the air, heavy and cold. It was not a name given by a loving mother, but a name earned in smoky saloons and dusty street duels. It was a name that carried the weight of a biblical curse, a name that spoke of violence and wandering. Thatcher's jaw tightened. He knew the name, not the man, but the type. He was the wind that blew through and left only destruction in its wake. But he had also, it seemed, saved his daughter. The conflict of it all was a bitter pill. "He's been shot, Pa," Laura said, breaking the tense silence. "He needs tending to." Thatcher grunted, his gaze never leaving Kane. "The world is full of men who get shot. Most of 'em earn it one way or another. The words were sharp, meant to probe, to wound. Kane's expression didn't flicker. Sometimes, he said, his voice quiet, a man gets shot helping someone who didn't earn it. The simple, unadorned truth of the statement disarmed the old man's hostility, if only for a moment. He gestured with his head toward the cabin. "Bring him inside," he said to Alara, the words tasting like gravel in his mouth. "Don't want him bleeding on my porch." Inside, the cabin was a single, large room, impeccably clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a large table and chairs sat in the center, and 2 beds were tucked into a corner, separated by a privacy curtain. It was a humble space, but it was filled with the quiet warmth of a home. Alara directed Kane to a chair at the table while she fetched a basin of water, clean cloths, and a bottle of carbolic acid. Thatcher stood by the door, his arms crossed, the rifle never leaving his side, his presence a silent, disapproving shadow. "Take off the duster and the shirt," Alara commanded gently. Kane did as he was told. The duster came off, followed by the shirt, revealing a body that was lean and hard, corded with the muscle of a man who lived a life of constant physical readiness. His skin was crisscrossed with the pale, silvery lines of old scars, a testament to a life lived on the edge of violence. There was a long, jagged scar along his ribs, a puckered mark on his thigh, and a small, round indentation just below his collarbone that could only have been from an old bullet wound. His body was a history book of pain. The new wound was a ragged tear in the fleshy part of his upper arm. The bullet had passed clean through, which was a blessing. But it was bleeding sluggishly and would need to be cleaned and stitched if it was to heal properly. Alara worked with a quiet competence, her touch gentle but firm. She washed away the blood and grime, her fingers brushing against his skin. A strange current passed between them at the contact, a silent acknowledgement of their shared, violent afternoon and this new, unexpected intimacy. Kane, for his part, sat perfectly still, his jaw tight against the stinging pain of the antiseptic, his eyes focused on a knot in the wooden table. He seemed unused to being cared for, as if the very concept of a gentle touch was a foreign language. "You're good at this," he said, his voice low, breaking the silence. "We live a long way from a doctor," Alara replied, threading a needle. "You learn to be your own sawbones. This is going to hurt." "I reckon it will," he said. She stitched the wound with small, neat sutures, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her hair had come loose from its braid and a few stray strands fell across her face. She was so close he could smell the faint, clean scent of soap and sunshine in her hair. It was a scent from a world he barely remembered, a world of warmth and safety that he had long ago left behind. He watched her, this girl with the steady hands and the fierce, kind eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a crack appeared in the wall of ice he had built around his heart. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly with a strip of clean linen. "There," she said, her work complete. "You'll need to rest. You've lost blood." "I'm obliged to you, miss," he said, his voice softer than before. "It's Alara," she said, meeting his gaze. "My name is Alara." "Alara," he repeated, as if tasting the name. "It's a pretty name." From his post by the door, Thatcher made a low, derisive sound. Pretty words from a man named Kane. The tension snapped back into the room. Alara shot her father a frustrated look, a silent plea to be civil. "You can stay the night," Thatcher said, his voice grudging. "Sleep in the barn. Your horse has been tended to. In the morning, you ride on. Our debt will be paid." "Pa," Alara protested. "He's in no condition to ride. He needs a few days to heal." "He is not family," Thatcher stated, his voice flat and final. "He is not welcome in this house. The barn is more than he can expect." One night, Kane slowly stood up, reaching for his shirt. He didn't argue. He seemed to expect this, to be accustomed to it. "The barn is fine," he said, nodding to Thatcher. "Thank you for your hospitality." He looked at Alara, and his stormy eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, grit, perhaps, or a deep, abiding sorrow. "And thank you, Alara, for your kindness." He walked out of the cabin, a solitary figure moving with a painful stiffness into the fading light of the evening. Alara watched him go, a fierce, protective anger rising in her. She turned on her father. "How could you be so cold?" she demanded. "That man saved my life." He bled for me. And you offer him the barn like he's a stray dog. That is exactly what he is, Thatcher retorted, his voice low and intense. A stray dog of the most dangerous kind. I've seen men like him my whole life, Alar. They carry death in their eyes and trouble on their heels. He's a gunslinger, a killer. Whatever goodness you think you see in him is a mask. Beneath it is a man who solves his problems with a bullet. The men who attack me solve their problems with bullets, she shot back. And he was the one who stopped them. He stopped them with more bullets. Thatcher's voice rose, a rare occurrence. You fight fire with fire, and you get a bigger fire. He brought the violence of his world into ours. I want it gone. He leaves in the morning. That is my final word. Alara stared at her father, her heart torn. She saw the genuine fear in his eyes, the fierce, primal need to protect her. But she also saw a stubborn prejudice, a refusal to see the man she had seen. She had seen more than a gunslinger. She had seen a flicker of vulnerability, a deep-seated loneliness that resonated with her own. Her father saw a threat. She saw a soul in need of saving. That night, after her father was asleep, his snores a low rumble in the quiet cabin, Alara slipped out and went to the barn. A single lantern cast a warm, golden glow inside. Cain was not asleep. He was sitting on a pile of hay, his back against the rough-hewn wall, staring into the darkness. His gun belt was coiled beside him, always within reach. She carried a tray with a plate of leftover stew, a piece of cornbread, and a tin cup of water. She set it down beside him. I thought you might be hungry. He looked at her, and a faint, sad smile touched his lips. Your father doesn't approve of me. My father is a stubborn old goat who sees the world in black and white, she said, sitting down a respectable distance away. He doesn't see the man who saved his daughter. He only sees the gun on your hip. Sometimes, Cain said, his gaze distant, that's all a man is. I don't believe that, she said softly. No one is just one thing. Why were you out there today? Where are you headed? He was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. I'm not heading anywhere in particular, he finally said. I'm mostly just leaving places behind. He picked up the cornbread and took a bite, as if the simple act of eating was a chore. You and your father. You've built something here. Something real. It's rare. It's all we have, she said. They talked for what felt like hours, though it was likely only one. She told him of her mother, who had died of a fever when she was a child. She told him of her dreams of seeing an ocean, a body of water so vast you couldn't see the other side. He, in turn, spoke in vague, shadowy terms of a life spent on the move, of towns that all looked the same, of sleeping with one eye open. He never spoke of his past, of what had set him on this lonely path, but he spoke of the path itself, and the profound weariness it had instilled in him. In the warm, lantern-lit intimacy of the barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses, the walls between them began to crumble. Alara saw beyond the gunman, to the lonely, wounded man beneath. And Cain, perhaps for the first time in years, allowed himself to bask in the unconditional warmth of simple human kindness. He was a ship that had been lost in a storm, and this quiet girl with the steady hands was a lighthouse, offering a temporary, and therefore all the more precious, harbor. When she finally left to go back to the cabin, she paused at the barn door. Heal well, Cain, she said. And stay. Stay until you're strong again. I'll make my father see reason. He watched her go, a small, resolute figure disappearing into the night. He knew he should leave at sunrise, just as the old man demanded. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. To stay was to invite complication, to risk tainting this small pocket of peace with the darkness that always followed him. But as he lay back in the hay, the pain in his arm a dull throb, it was not the thought of the trail ahead that filled his mind. It was the memory of her gentle touch, the sound of her voice, and the stubborn, irrational hope she had ignited in the barren landscape of his soul. For the first time in a long time, Cain was tempted to disobey an order. He was tempted to stay. The sun rose the next morning, and Cain did not leave. Alara won the silent war with her father not through argument, but through a display of quiet and yielding defiance. She took Cain his breakfast in the barn, changed his dressing, and spoke to him as if his staying was the most natural thing in the world. Thatcher watched from the porch, his face a thundercloud, but he said nothing. To force the issue would be to truly cross a line with his daughter, and he was a man who, for all his gruffness, was terrified of losing the only family he had left. So he retreated into a stony, disapproving silence, his presence a constant, low-grade storm on the edge of their small world. Cain was allowed to stay, but he was a prisoner of the barn, an unwelcome guest tolerated only by the fierce loyalty of the girl who had appointed herself his protector. The days that followed fell into a strange, tense rhythm. Laura divided her time between her ranch chores and caring for Cain. She found herself making excuses to go to the barn, bringing him books she had read a dozen times, or simply sitting with him while she mended a piece of tack, just to fill the space with quiet companionship. Their conversations continued to be a careful dance, a slow circling of the painful truths that defined his life. He remained a man of shadows, but in her presence, the shadows seemed to shrink. He would watch her work, a small, almost imperceptible smile sometimes touching his lips. He was like a man learning a forgotten language, the language of peace, of simple, honest work, of a life lived not in moments of violent survival, but in the steady, reassuring passage of days. He began to heal, both in body and, it seemed, in spirit. The color returned to his face, and the haunted, weary look in his eyes began to be replaced by something softer, something that looked suspiciously like hope. He started to help, at first in small ways. He used his good arm to whittle a new handle for a broken shovel. He showed Laura a better way to braid a rope, his long, scarred fingers surprisingly nimble. Each small act was a bridge, a way of earning his keep, of trying to belong in a place he knew he had no right to be. But as the warmth between Cain and Laura grew, the chill emanating from Thatcher intensified. The old man saw everything, and he interpreted it all through the lens of his suspicion. He saw the way Cain watched his daughter, and he didn't see gratitude. He saw the patient appraisal of a predator. He saw the way Laura smiled at the stranger, and he didn't see compassion. He saw the naive fascination of a lamb with a wolf. The house, which had once been a sanctuary of two, now felt crowded and suffocating with unspoken conflict of three. The tension was a constant, simmering presence, most palpable during the evenings. Laura, in a bold move, had insisted Cain eat supper with them at the cabin. He would sit at one end of the table, Thatcher at the other, with Laura in the middle, a desperate and increasingly frail buffer between two opposing forces. The meals were exercises in silent warfare. Thatcher would make a point of cleaning his rifle at the table, the metallic click-clack of the action a deliberate, menacing sound. Cain would eat in silence, his gaze fixed on his plate, his posture relaxed but with a coiled stillness beneath, like a spring wound tight. "I see you're handy with a knife," Thatcher said one evening, watching Cain expertly slice his salt pork. His voice was casual, but the edge was sharp. "A man on his own learns to be handy with many things," Cain replied, not looking up. "I imagine so," Thatcher continued, his eyes glinting in the lamplight. "A knife, a gun, the tools of a certain trade. A trade that leaves a lot of bodies in its wake." "Pa, please," Laura whispered, her face tense. "I'm just making conversation with our guest, daughter," Thatcher said, his gaze locked on Cain. "A man ought to know who he's breaking bread with. You ride into a place, you solve a problem with violence, and then you stay. A man might wonder what kind of problem you're running from, or what kind you're looking to start." Cain carefully placed his knife and fork on his plate. He raised his head and met the old man's hostile stare. His stormy eyes were not angry, but filled with a profound sadness. "Mr. Thatcher," he said, his voice low and steady, "I have never, in my life, confused what I am with what I wish I could be. I know what you see when you look at me, and I can't rightly say that you're wrong. But I can tell you this. I have never raised my hand to a man who didn't raise his to me first. And I have never, ever, brought harm to those who have shown me kindness." The conviction in his voice was so absolute, so deeply felt, that it momentarily silenced Thatcher. Laura looked at Cain with a swelling heart. He was a good man. She knew it. He was a man who had been dealt a bad hand and was simply trying to play it with what little honor he had left. But Thatcher was not convinced. His instincts, honed by a lifetime of survival, screamed that something was wrong. There was a coldness in Cain, a core of hard, polished steel that he kept carefully hidden. Thatcher would catch glimpses of it sometimes. A fleeting expression in the man's eyes when he thought no one was looking, a look of such utter ruthlessness that it made the old man's blood run cold. Or the way he would sometimes stop and stand perfectly still, his head cocked, listening to the wind, as if assessing a threat that only he could perceive. It was the ingrained hypervigilance of a man who expects an attack from every shadow. The old man tried to warn his daughter, to make her see. "He's playing you, Alara," he told her one afternoon while they were mending the corral fence, well out of earshot of the cabin. "Men like that know how to seem gentle. They know how to say the right things. It's how they get close. It's a tool, just like their gun." "You're wrong about him, Pa," Alara insisted, her voice tight with frustration. "You just refuse to see the good in him because you're scared." "You're damn right I'm scared." Thatcher's voice was a harsh whisper. "I'm scared for you. You look at him, and you see a wounded bird. I look at him and I see a hawk, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike." Their disagreement was a chasm that was growing wider with each passing day. Alara retreated further into her defense of Cain, her belief in his inherent goodness becoming an article of faith. And Thatcher retreated further into his mistrust, watching the stranger with the grim, wary patience of a man on death watch. The breaking point was nearing. The fragile piece of the Thatcher homestead was stretched to its limit. Cain's wound was almost fully healed. Soon, there would be no more excuses for him to stay. A decision would have to be made. He would have to ride on, or Alara would have to make a choice between the man she was beginning to love and the father who loved her more than life itself. The air in the house grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken resentments and simmering fears. It was the calm before a storm, a deep, deceptive stillness before the inevitable eruption of violence that Thatcher had been predicting all along. The shadow in the house was no longer just a guest. It was becoming a part of the family, and its darkness was beginning to extinguish all the light. The final day began with a lie. It was a beautiful, clear morning, the sky a crisp, high blue, the air scrubbed clean by a brief overnight rain. The world felt fresh, new, and full of promise. It was the kind of day that made a person believe in second chances. Alara woke with a sense of hopeful anticipation. Cain's arm was healed. He was strong again. Today, she had decided, she would ask him to stay. Not for another week, but for good. She would confront her father, make him see reason, and they would build a new life, the three of them. The loneliness she had felt for so long had been replaced by a tentative, thrilling dream of a future. Cain seemed to feel the change in the air, too. At breakfast, he was less guarded, his conversation with Alara more open and easy than it had ever been. He told her a story from his youth, a sanitized, carefully edited version, no doubt about learning to fish with his grandfather. It was a small, simple piece of his past, but it was a gift, and Alara received it with a grateful heart. Thatcher, however, was a block of granite at the end of the table. The more at ease Cain appeared, the more suspicious the old man became. He saw the easy smiles exchanged between his daughter and the gunman, and the fear in his gut tightened into a cold, hard knot. He saw the hawk, circling lower, ready to strike. He had made a decision of his own. The moment breakfast was over, Cain was leaving. The debt was paid. The danger would be excised from their lives. "Cain," Thatcher said, his voice cutting through the pleasant atmosphere like a shard of glass. "Your arm is healed. The weather is clear. It's a good day for riding." It was not a suggestion. It was an eviction notice. Alara's head snapped toward her father. "Pa!" Cain's faint smile vanished. The mask of the weary wanderer slipped back into place. He nodded slowly. "You're right, Mr. Thatcher. It's time I was on my way." He looked at Alara, his eyes full of a deep and spoken apology. "No," Alara said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. She stood up, her chair scraping on the wooden floor. "No, you're not leaving." She turned to her father, her eyes pleading. "Pa, we need him here. He can help with the ranch. He's a good man." "I know he is." "You know nothing," Thatcher's voice boomed, his control finally shattering. He stood up as well, his face flushed with anger. "You are a blind, foolish girl who has been charmed by a snake. He is a killer, and he will bring nothing but death to this house." "The only one bringing anger to this house is you," Alara cried, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. Cain remained seated, his head bowed, as if the argument was a physical weight pressing down on him. He looked like a man trapped between two worlds, the peaceful life he desperately wanted and the violent one he could never escape. "That's it," Thatcher snarled. He strode over to the pegs by the door and grabbed Kane's gun belt. He threw it onto the table with a loud thud. The Colt lay there, dark and sinister, the symbol of everything the old man feared and hated. "Take your gun and get out of my house. Now." "I will not let you do this," Alara shouted, moving to stand between her father and Kane. "Get out of the way, Alara," Thatcher commanded, his voice shaking with rage. "No." Everything happened in a horrifying, slow-motion cascade. Thatcher, blinded by his fury and his desperate need to protect his daughter, reached for the Colt on the table. He intended to unload it, to remove its symbolic power from the room, to force Kane out unarmed if he had to. It was a foolish, reckless move, born of a lifetime of fear reaching its boiling point. But Kane did not see a father trying to disarm a threat. He saw a man, enraged and shouting, reaching for a gun. His reactions were not his own. They belonged to a decade of survival, of back alley ambushes and saloon standoffs. They were instincts, honed to a razor's edge, that operated faster than thought, faster than reason, faster than mercy. He moved. He was not the gentle, wounded man Alara had nursed. He was not the quiet companion she had shared her dreams with. In that single, fluid motion, he became the thing her father had always seen. A killer. He didn't reach for the gun on the table. He had another one. A small, flat-bellied derringer, hidden in a holster strapped to his ankle. It was the weapon of an assassin, a back shooter, a man who never left himself defenseless. He kicked his chair back, dropped to one knee, and drew the hidden gun in a single, seamless movement. Alara saw the flash of metal in his hand. She saw her father, his hand just inches from the Colt. She saw Kane's face. It was a face she had never seen before. It was a cold, empty mask. The eyes were chips of ice. All the warmth, all the kindness, all the hope she had seen in him was gone, as if it had never existed. It had all been a lie. Her father had been right. "No," she screamed. But the word was lost in the deafening roar of the gunshot. The sound was shockingly loud in the enclosed space of the cabin. A cloud of acrid, gray smoke filled the air. For a heart-stopping second, time stood still. Thatcher jerked back, a look of profound, shocked disbelief on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. His hand, which had been reaching for the Colt, fell to his side. He looked at Alara, his eyes wide with a silent, agonizing question. Then, his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floorboards, a heavy, final sound. The silence that followed was a physical thing, a crushing weight that sucked all the air from the room. Alara stood frozen, paralyzed, her mind refusing to process what her eyes had just seen. The smoke cleared. She saw her father, lying so terribly still on the floor that had been his home for 30 years. She saw Kane, still kneeling, the small, ugly derringer smoking in his hand. And she saw his face. The cold, empty mask was still there. There was no shock. No remorse, no horror at what he had done. There was only the calm, appraising look of a professional who had just completed a job. The trust she had so carefully built, the love that had just begun to bloom in her heart, all of it shattered into a million pieces. It was not just a death she had witnessed. It was the murder of her entire world. The man she had saved, nursed, and defended was not a wounded soul. He was a monster. The bullet he had fired had not just killed her father. It had pierced the heart of her own foolish, naive faith, and in its place, a black, burning void of hatred began to open. He was not her savior. He was just another man who had brought a tragedy to her door, a tragedy far more cruel and personal than the one he had supposedly saved her from. The stranger had finally shown his true face, and Alara would never be the same. For a long, terrible moment, the world was nothing but the gunshot's echo and the sight of her father's still form on the floor. Alara's mind was a maelstrom of white noise and denial. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. In a moment, her father would groan, sit up, and curse the stranger for his carelessness. Kane would rush to his side, his face etched with regret, and the horrible, impossible moment would pass. But the silence stretched on, brutal and absolute. The coppery scent of fresh blood began to snake its way through the lingering smell of gunpowder, a smell that would be forever burned into her memory. Her father did not move, and Cain did not move to help. He simply rose to his feet, the smoking derringer held loosely at his side, his expression unreadable. He looked from Thatcher's body to Alara, and in his eyes, she saw not a hint of the man she thought she knew. The warmth, the weariness, the vulnerability had all been a performance. What was left was the cold, hard bedrock of his true nature. He was a stone, a killer. Her father had been right. Oh God, her father had been right all along. The dam of shock inside her broke, and a flood of pure, undiluted agony washed through her. A sound tore itself from her throat, a raw, ragged cry that was part grief and part the birth scream of a terrible new resolve. The pain was a physical thing, a white-hot poker in her chest, but it did not paralyze her. It transformed. The agony became fuel. The grief became a cold, hard diamond of rage. Her eyes, which had been wide with horror, narrowed into slits. The tears that had welled up did not fall. They seemed to boil away in the heat of her fury. Her gaze shifted from her father's body to the Schofield revolver her father had been wearing, its handle now just visible from beneath his crumpled form. Cain saw the shift. He saw the grief in her eyes curdle into something hard and dangerous. "Alara," he said, his voice flat, a warning. "Don't." His word was a spark on a powder keg. Her hand darted down, her fingers closing around the familiar worn grip of her father's gun. She ripped it free and came up, the heavy revolver feeling like a natural extension of her arm, of her rage. She leveled it at Cain's chest, her hand surprisingly steady. "You bastard," she hissed, the words tasting like poison and ash. "You lying, murdering bastard." The cozy, sunlit cabin had become a cage. The two of them faced each other across the terrible space where her father's body lay, separated by a chasm of betrayal that could never be bridged. The air was thick and heavy, the golden morning light slanting through the window panes seeming like a sacrilege. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window frames and howling around the eaves of the cabin, a mournful chorus to the tragedy unfolding within. Cain did not raise his own gun. He simply watched her, his head tilted slightly, an unreadable expression on his face. The cold mask was still in place, but there was a flicker in his eyes now, something ancient and weary. He looked like a man who had played this scene 1,000 times and was tired of the ending. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. It was the voice he had used with her in the barn, and hearing it now, from the face of her father's killer, was a violation that stoked her rage even higher. "Shut up," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare talk to me with that voice. The man I talked to in the barn is dead." Was he ever even real? "He was," Cain said. "More real than I've been in a long time." "Liar." The word was a gunshot of its own. "You came here for this, didn't you? This was always your plan. What did he have that you wanted?" "This ranch. It's nothing. It's just dust and heartbreak." "It wasn't about the ranch," he said, taking a small, almost imperceptible step to his left, away from the direct line of the doorway. He was positioning himself, his killer's instincts still at work. The movement, small as it was, galvanized Alara. He was still the predator, still calculating his odds. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The hammer of the Schofield was already cocked, the action gritty and loud in the tense silence. It would take nothing more than a thought, a twitch of a muscle, to send a bullet into the chest of the man who had destroyed her life. "You won't leave this room alive," she promised, her voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper. "I swear on my father's grave, you will die on this floor." The lamplight from the still-burning morning lamp flickered across his face, carving it into stark planes of light and shadow. The handsome features she had once admired now looked cruel and demonic. She saw the truth of him now, a truth written in her father's blood. He was not a wounded bird. He was the serpent, and she had welcomed him into her heart, only to have him sink his fangs into everything she loved. The hate she felt was a pure and cleansing fire, burning away the naive, trusting girl she had been that morning. In her place stood a woman, armed and avenging, with nothing left to lose. The duel her father had always feared was here, but it was not between him and the stranger. It was between the gunman and the daughter he had made an orphan. And in the confines of that small wooden cabin, with the desert wind screaming outside, there was only room for one of them to walk away. The world shrank to the dimensions of the cabin. Everything outside its sun, the sky, The wind ceased to exist. There was only the floorboard, the body of her father, and the man who had put him there. Every detail was etched in Alara's mind with hyper-realistic clarity: the pattern of the wood grain on the table, the faint scent of coffee from the breakfast pot, the way the lamplight caught the silver concho on Cain's hatband. This was the arena, the place where her life had ended, and where her vengeance would be born. Cain's stillness was the most terrifying thing about him. He stood there, the small derringer still in his hand, making no move to raise it, yet he was cold like a rattlesnake. His eyes never left hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw not fear, but a deep, chilling resignation. It was as if he was offering her the choice, giving her the power to pull the trigger, to become what he was. It was the cruelest temptation. "This is what you do, isn't it?" Alara's voice was a low, guttural thing, and recognizable as her own. "You walk into people's lives, you make them trust you, and then you tear them apart. Is it a game to you?" "There's no game, Alara," he said, his voice soft. "Only debts. Sooner or later, every man has to pay what he owes. My father owed you nothing." "Not him," Cain said, and for the first time, a flicker of raw emotion broke through his mask, a flash of pain so profound it was startling. "The debt was mine." The cryptic words meant nothing to her. They were just the ramblings of a murderer trying to justify the unjustifiable. Her grip on the Schofield tightened, her knuckles white. Her father had taught her to shoot, to aim for the center of mass, to squeeze the trigger, not jerk it. The lessons came back to her now, a ghostly whisper in the back of her mind. "You think I can't do it," she breathed, her gaze unwavering. "You think because I showed you kindness, I don't have the steel to pull this trigger." "No," Cain said. "I think you do. I saw the steel in you the day we met. It's why I stayed." That was the final betrayal. He had seen her strength, her resilience, and had twisted it, used it as his reason for bringing this ruin upon her. The fire of her rage burned hotter, searing away the last of her hesitation. She fired. The roar of the heavy Schofield was a physical blow, a concussive force that slammed against the walls of the small cabin. She had not aimed to kill. In that last, split second, some deep-seated part of her, the part that had nursed him, had flinched. The bullet tore a splintered gouge out of the log wall just past his head, showering his shoulder with shards of wood. The shot broke his stillness. He moved with the blinding speed she had witnessed once before, diving to the side, rolling behind the thick oak table. The clatter of the breakfast plates crashing to the floor was a sharp, percussive sound in the aftermath of the gunshot. The cabin became a battlefield. Alara dropped to a crouch, using the corner of the stone fireplace as cover. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of adrenaline and fury. She had fired the first shot. There was no going back. "Give it up, Alara," Cain's voice came from behind the overturned table. "Walk out the door. Right away and don't look back. This doesn't have to be your fight. You made it my fight when you murdered my father," she screamed back, her voice breaking with grief and rage. She risked a glance around the edge of the fireplace. A shot rang out. Not the deep boom of her Schofield, but the sharp crack of the derringer. A bullet slammed into the stone an inch from her face, spitting rock dust into her eyes. She jerked back, her heart leaping into her throat. He wasn't just defending himself. He was fighting back. The duel became a deadly game of cat and mouse in the confined space. The single room was now a maze of overturned furniture and treacherous open ground. The light from the single lamp cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar shapes into monstrous, threatening forms. Each creak of a floorboard, each gust of wind rattling the shutters, was a potential threat. Alara knew she had a disadvantage. He was a professional, a man who had lived his life in moments like these. She was a rancher's daughter, fueled by a righteous but inexperienced fury. But this was her home. She knew every inch of it. She knew the loose floorboard near the hearth, the way the pantry door swung open on its own. This was her ground. She needed to move, to get a better angle. She could hear him, a faint rustle of cloth from behind the table. He was reloading his small, two-shot pistol, or perhaps reaching for the Colt that still lay near her father's body. She had to act now. In a mad dash, she scrambled from the fireplace to the relative cover of her bed, her world a blur of motion. As she landed behind it, the deep roar of the Colt Peacemaker filled the room. Cain had gotten to his primary weapon. A heavy caliber slug ripped through the mattress where her head had been a second before, tearing a hole through the quilt her mother had made and burying itself in the log wall behind. She lay there, panting, the smell of gunpowder and her own fear thick in her nostrils. He was toying with her, driving her back. He could have killed her then. He was that good. The thought was infuriating. It was pity, the one thing she could not bear from him. Her rage gave her an idea. A cruel, desperate gambit. From her position, she could just see the edge of the oil lamp, still sitting precariously on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. With her left hand, she pulled a small, silver-backed mirror from the drawer of her nightstand, a gift from her father on her 16th birthday. Her hand was shaking, but she held it steady, extending it just beyond the edge of the bed. In its reflection, she could see him, a dark shape crouched behind the table, the long barrel of the Colt pointed in her direction. She held her breath, lined up the shot, and fired. Her bullet missed him, as she knew it would, but it struck the stone hearth, sending a shower of sparks into the air. One of those sparks, a tiny, malevolent ember, landed in the small pool of spilled oil at the base of the lamp. The effect was instantaneous. A line of fire raced up the side of the lamp, and with a soft whoomp, the glass chimney shattered, and the entire lamp burst into a ball of hungry, orange flame. "Fire!" Kane yelled, his voice sharp with alarm. But it was too late. The flames licked at the dry, oil-soaked wood of the mantelpiece. They touched the edge of a calico curtain. The fire, once born, began to spread with a terrifying, unnatural speed, feeding on the dry, seasoned wood of the cabin, on the fabric of their lives, on the very air of the tragedy. The smoke began to thicken, acrid and choking. The reckoning in splintered wood had just become a funeral pyre. The fire was a living entity. It roared with a greedy, triumphant voice, a third combatant in the small, deadly room. Flames climbed the log walls like insane, orange vines, and the smoke boiled down from the ceiling, a thick, suffocating blanket that stung the eyes and tore at the lungs. The heat was a physical blow, intense and unbearable. The cabin, her sanctuary, was being transformed into an inferno. Panic, primal and overwhelming, threatened to consume Alara. Her survival instinct screamed at her to flee, to get out into the clean air, to escape the searing heat and choking smoke. But the sight of her father's body, now shrouded in the swirling gray haze, anchored her. Her rage was stronger than her fear. This cabin was already a tomb. She would not leave until Kane joined her father in it. Through a shimmering curtain of heat and smoke, she saw Kane move. He was no longer behind the table. He was crawling toward the door, his body low to the floor where the air was clearer. He wasn't trying to fight anymore. He was trying to escape. "Coward!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ragged thing. She rose from behind the bed, ignoring the flames that were now licking at the quilt, and stumbled through the smoke-filled room, her eyes burning, her lungs on fire. She saw him reach the door, his hand on the wooden latch. He was going to leave her here. Leave her to burn with her father, with the ghosts of the life he had stolen. The injustice of it, his sheer, ultimate cowardice, was a final, unforgivable sin. She raised the Schofield, both hands struggling to hold it steady. She could barely see him through the smoke and her own streaming, tear-filled eyes. She aimed for the center of the dark shape and pulled the trigger again, and again, emptying the gun in a final, desperate fusillade of fury and grief. One of the shots found its mark. She heard his sharp grunt of pain, and he staggered, falling against the door, his arm sliding from the latch. He turned, his face a ghostly mask in the swirling smoke, and looked at her. He raised the Colt, but it was a slow, labored movement. His strength was failing. At the same moment, a heavy, fire-weakened ceiling beam groaned, splintered, and crashed down between them in a shower of sparks and embers. The way was blocked. They were trapped on opposite sides of a wall of fire. Alara collapsed to her knees, the heavy, empty revolver falling from her nerveless fingers. Her strength was gone, consumed by the adrenaline and the smoke. She was choking, her vision tunneling to a small, dark circle. The heat was blistering her skin. She looked across the flames at Kane. He was slumped against the door, trying to push himself up, but his body wouldn't obey. She could see a dark stain spreading across his chest. Their eyes met through the inferno. In that final, terrible moment, the fire seemed to burn away everything but the truth. The smoke, The rage, the betrayal, it all fell away, and she saw him. Not the monster, not the killer, but the man from the barn. His eyes, in the fiery light, were filled with an unbearable, agonizing regret. It was the look of a man who was dying with the weight of 1,000 sins on his soul, and her betrayal was the heaviest of them all. He opened his mouth, as if to say something, a final word, a name. Her name. But only a choked cough came out. He slumped further down, his head lolling to the side. The fire roared, consuming everything. It took the curtains her mother had sewn. It took the table her father had built. It took the books she had read by the hearth. It was erasing her entire life, turning it all to smoke and ash. She looked at her father's body, now being licked by the encroaching flames. A strange, terrible peace settled over her. There was nothing left to fight for. The world outside this burning room no longer held anything for her. She lay down on the floorboards that had been her home, the smoke a thick, merciful blanket. Her last sensation was the intense, cleansing heat. Her last vision was of the flames, reaching for her, a final, fiery embrace. Outside, the desert wind howled, carrying sparks and embers high into the dark, indifferent sky. The solitary cabin, which had stood for so long as a lonely bastion of hope and persistence against the harshness of the land, was now a roaring funeral pyre. Inside, a daughter, a father, and a stranger were united in a final, tragic tableau of misplaced trust and violent retribution. The blood they had shed soaked into the wooden floor, only to be consumed, along with their secrets and their sorrows, by the unforgiving flames, closing the final, terrible chapter on a story of kindness repaid with betrayal, and a debt paid in fire and ash.